switchboard is lighting up with calls about this issue, about the campus wars in the United States, much less so here, where we have these weekly demonstrations. Maybe that's why we don't have the issue on university campuses to the same extent as they do in the United States, because that takes some of the sting out of it. But still, it is a massive issue, how we respond to the Israel-Gaza war. Everyone seems to have an opinion on it. It has literally dominated conversation more than anything I can remember, certainly much more than the Ukraine war in recent years. Why is that the case, and how do you feel about it? And is there at all in any of this, as there should be, some kind of middle ground? Let's go to Nick, first-time caller from Limehouse. Nick, welcome to the programme.
Matt, thank you. And first of all, I do have a stinking hangover and I'm 24.
Okay.
Just to give you my view on
I tell you why I mention this, because I did a show the other day, which is entirely about students, and the jobs they get after university. And I was hoping that the lines would be flooded by young people like you, and hardly anyone called up until I started getting really shirty on air, saying, get out of bed, pick the phone up, because I know what happens on a Friday night. Of course, I'm very pure on a Friday night because I've got to work early on a Saturday morning, so I go to bed with my cup of Horlicks or mint tea, and that's about it. But you are different, so I salute you. Let's get to the subject. Enough blather from me. Come on, give me your views.
So I feel why young people feel so strongly against the war in Israel is because I think over the years we have seen that war achieves nothing. If you look back in Afghanistan, it took 4 US presidents, trillions of dollars, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. What has it achieved? It costs so much money. It destroys lives. It's 2024. We should be looking at bettering humanity. Why should we need to spend money on defence? Why should we need all these weapons? We're humans. We all breathe oxygen.
Well, of course, that's a very general point, Nick, you make there. We all love, we love peace and we hate war, but we are in a very different reality to that. So I just wonder whether you think, especially on this particular issue, the Israeli government, the IDF, have been widely criticised, including by their best friends in Washington and London and Berlin, for going over the top, going too far, being too brutal in the number of civilians that have been killed. But at the same time, this did have this particular chapter, this iteration of this long conflict, did have a beginning on October the 7th, did it not?
It did, yes, indeed.
Right. And I think isn't that important to remember that as well? Because if you forget what happened then, you will not really understand what's happened since then. And of course, it makes people who, in Israel or British Jews or American Jews feel that their side of the story is not fully heard either.
Yeah, absolutely. And bearing in mind, there is a lot of propaganda out there which manipulates people in the wrong way. And whether you believe that or you don't, it's a fact. We are all kind of brainwashed to believe one side.
Well, we're not all brainwashed. I mean, you can look at both sides of the argument, and I think you can come to a fairly reasonable conclusion without too much, too much heartache or brain power to say, well, actually, both sides have a point, and at the end of the day, both sides need to bury their hatchets somehow, because neither side is going to just disappear.
Yeah, absolutely. And the war will not disappear. It's not going to end, is it? It's going to be an ongoing battle. I mean, Hamas, how can you distinguish Hamas from a civilian? You cannot. Civilians are losing their life unnecessarily. Now, obviously... I tell you,
can I just interrupt, Nick? There's an interesting detail that I picked up in some of the papers yesterday, which is that inside the Gaza Strip, and I know this to some extent from my own experience when I was there during the last war, which is an entirely different affair to this one. But inside the Gaza Strip, the anti-Hamas voices are becoming more audible. There are more and more Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip who, of course, blame Israel for the destruction, but they also blame Hamas for having triggered this degree of destruction. And, there are no opinion polls, obviously. The place is a mess. 60% of the buildings are flattened. But they are getting increasingly upset with what Hamas has been doing. And when I was there last, there were lots of people who told me ever so quietly that they didn't like what Hamas was doing, but they were afraid to raise their voices. Maybe that's not the case anymore. At the same time, the support for Hamas in the West Bank and in southern Lebanon, for instance, is growing, right? Yeah. So there's a political problem here, which is very tricky for the Israelis and indeed the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah to deal with.
Absolutely, and the reason Lebanon pro Hamas is because they're not living under Hamas. They're not there.
Indeed.
Right?
Okay, Nick, thank you very much. Let's go to Katherine in Muswell Hill. Katherine, you're on the air.
Hello,
Hello.
Matt. I've got a couple of things to say about this, maybe more than a couple. I'm Jewish.
Right.
I'm a similar age to you. I definitely see a generational divide between my own children. My eldest daughter actually is in her last year of her PhD at Columbia, so I've heard about
is she? Oh, that's interesting.
What she's experiencing. Now, I was brought up not knowing I was Jewish, and that's because my mother's a Holocaust survivor, and my father was a refugee. And I literally lived, I think, the last however many years of my life until October the 7th last year, with no great sense of anti-Semitism or my Jewishness, or I didn't know I was Jewish until I was nearly an adult. And that was a very deliberate decision on behalf of my parents, because they had grown up in a world in which being Jewish brought real danger and loss and tragedy to their lives. So they wanted to protect my sister and I from that. I can honestly say that for the first time in my life, I kind of understand that sentiment. I'm not for a moment saying, it's the same intensity and landscape as what they experienced. I'm not. But for the first time in my life, being Jewish feels something that has become difficult, and it has never felt difficult before. And when I try and identify, what that is, and I listen to people calling into your show, and I listen to podcasts, and I listen to the news, and I read stuff and so on, what I hear is a terrifying sort of mishmash of fast information. For example, after October the 7th, the speed with which people just immediately felt they understood the whole Middle Eastern sort of history and landscape and geopolitical and everything, I found it astonishing. I certainly didn't understand it and know it, and like many people, had to spend weeks and months sort of trying to educate myself. The speed with which people go from Israeli state, IDF, Zionist, Jewish, they roll the whole thing up into some easy mix of ideology, and you can barely call it that. It's so half-baked, is a terrifying example of groupthink. And I worry that a lot of people, and I may well be included in that. Of course, I'm just as susceptible as anyone else. I listen to stuff, I read stuff, might be manipulated by, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, whatever that actually means, malign forces that want us to think a certain way, that have an interest in dividing our communities, our democracies, because we are a very divided place at the moment. I'm really talking about here in the UK, also in the US. Like I say, my daughter's at Columbia. I worry that it's become very hostile, very difficult. I don't agree with your contributor, Nicole Lampert, that universities have always been bastions of anti-Semitism. That is absolutely not my experience, nor do I agree that most Jews are Zionists. I don't even know necessarily what that means. My view on Israel is that it's here now. I'm not really interested in whether you are or were a Zionist. It's here. So unless you are proposing that it was a bad idea to begin with, in which case we could look at an awful lot of countries around the world and apply the same, moral scrutiny, then what exactly are you suggesting? And I just think so many people who try and give an opinion, and like I say, I'm giving my opinion, but what I'm trying to say is that it's really way more complicated. And when Jews are made to feel unwelcome or derided in some way because they are Jewish, that is racism. It's very simple. It's just racism. And it's not only Jews that should be upset about that. It's any of us that care about racism and how our communities are divided and manipulated and set against each other.
I have to say, Katherine, that was one of the most sensible calls I've heard on the entire subject, and we've been talking about very little else, in the last 7 months or so. So I really thank you for that. There's an awful lot of abuse coming out on social media right now, and I have to say, get real, guys. This is nonsense. Try and take a more nuanced view of what's going on. Try and see both sides of this argument. And, there's someone here who says, this didn't start with October the 7th, and I won't say what he said after that. Hang on a minute. This, as I said, this particular iteration, this chapter of an ongoing long saga did start on October the 7th. But the conditions for it existed previously. That doesn't justify October the 7th. It explains some of October the 7th. So you've got to take the context view. You've got to be a bit more nuanced. You've got to try and step back from the anger, because otherwise you end up where we are at the moment in 20 university campuses in the US with both sides screaming at each other. And protests being shut down by the police, Jewish students feeling that that there's rising anti-Semitism. None of this should be happening. And of course it's easy to say that from here because of the levels of violence in Gaza, especially at the moment, and in Israel on October the 7th, were completely unacceptable. But at the end of the day, and I think this is almost a sort of comforting thought, you can't get rid of either population. They are there to stay, whether you like it or not. You've got to come to some kind of arrangement, which is the only hope that the so-called two-state solution still has. I just want to remind you of the tone of the coverage of the pro-Palestinian protest being put down by the police, and conversely on US campuses, where 20 universities are now embroiled in what people are calling the campus wars. Just listen to this.
Protests turned to chaos on campuses across the country, from Yale University, Columbia University, and the University of Texas in Austin.
At Ohio State overnight, police clashing with pro-Palestinian protesters, 36 arrested. Students calling on schools to divest from companies that profit from ties to Israel.
Palestine protests that took root at Columbia University and spread across the country show no signs of letting up, although some colleges are cracking down.
Okay, well, that's a sort of fairly mild taste of what's been going on. I mean, there's some very powerful stuff on social media of, the professor of philosophy at one of the universities, a woman in her 50s, late 50s, being arrested and then being, wrestled to the ground by two very beefy policemen. Something similar happening to another female professor at another university. I mean, this is really, really ugly stuff. And instead of these university protests being shut down, they've just been inflamed and have doubled in size in many cases. Tons of calls coming in. As I said, let's go to Muzz in Woodford. Muzz, you're on the air.
Yeah, I was just calling just to say, about the original question is, why is it that the younger generation are so invested in this? And I think it's all to do with the fact that they've got access to so much more information. They've seen, that the one side has all the power. It's got the guns, it's got the tanks, it's got the missiles, it's got the planes and so on. The other side has rocks. And there's a complete asymmetry in terms of the violence which has been enacted by one side. And, you said it yourself, most of the people in Gaza probably don't like Hamas. Not like they've had an opportunity to vote for anyone else, but they are now suffering because they've got no opportunity. They've got no other access to any other external services or sources or even allies. They are there, they're stuck in one place, and they're being pounded for a bunch of people which had power taking action, which they're disempowered, and now another power which has got even more power is taking revenge against them. And
so what do you think, Maz, what should Israel's response in your mind have been like after October the 7th? What should they have done?
What should they have done? Really take a look internally. I think they should have been in introspection. The fact that they've got issues in the West Bank where there's no Hamas, and they've got this problem in Gaza, suggests that the problem isn't Hamas, it's their policies. They should really take a look at their policies and see whether or not it's going to bring them lasting peace or whether or not it's going to inflame the situation.
But if Hamas go over the fence and they kill 1,200 mostly civilian Israelis in their safe rooms in their houses, and I mean I've seen the aftermath of that. It was appalling butchery, and there is butchery on both sides, but that was an appalling act of butchery. It would be very hard to imagine them not responding militarily. I think this country would have done, Germany would have done, Luxembourg would have done,
I understand your point, but I find that really difficult question to answer because, the starting point of this conversation is that October 7th initiated this round of killings. But, a few years before that, there was what was it the Israelis called it, mowing the grass. So they went and they
mowing the lawn, yeah.
Mowing the lawn, yeah. So they bombarded Gaza. So, what was the repercussions of that? There wasn't,
Well, yeah, I was there. I mean, I was there at the time. I was in Gaza at the time, and it was terrifying. And I would like to have gone back into Gaza this time, although it was much more dangerous this time. And there is, and then at that particular war 2 years ago, excuse me, was an Israeli response to something that Hamas had done. Hamas is also engaged in a kind of, not a war, but certainly a conflict, sometimes military, sometimes political, with the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. They basically say that they're in a better position to represent the rights and ambitions of the Palestinian people than the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah is. And you could argue about that. But that started with Hamas, and then again, in the context of this thing which has been going on for ages, and then led to a very robust Israeli response. And
I think that point there is really a difficult one for me to consume as being, a legitimate one, because we have, Netanyahu on camera saying that he supported Hamas in order to get rid of Fatah.
Yeah. So, that's true. I mean, that is. I mean, the Israeli argument is undermined by the fact that they have been playing politics with intra-Palestinian politics themselves. And, I think the accusation against Netanyahu is that he finds it easier to deal with an entity like Hamas that doesn't even recognize the existence of Israel, precisely because it means he doesn't have to engage in something that he fundamentally dislikes, which is a two-state solution. But then you ask yourself, what's the plan? What are you going to do? And, that is the really tricky thing for me. And, if you look at what the Israeli finance minister Smotrich said last year, he said Palestinians have three choices. They can either become second-class citizens in a greater Israel, they can flee to a place like Jordan, or they can die in the pursuit of their cause. These are not three choices that they should be facing.
And it's that information which is, available to the younger generation. They see this. It is, encapsulated in small clips which they can then see. And it makes it very difficult for them to not see that there is a complete asymmetry in terms of power. You have one side which has all of the power. You've got the other side which has none of the power. And, whether or not you agree with the creation of Israel as a state, they do see that one side has lost land and they've continued to lose over the years. So I think that's what's inflamed the situation, and it will continue to do so. And as to what Israel should do about this, there's no military action that they can take other than a complete removal of the Palestinian people that will bring them peace. There's no military action.
That's according to the extremists. I mean, but that's not going to happen. That's 5.4 million people. They're not going to be removed, right? Just as 9 million Israelis aren't going to be removed. As Katherine, the previous caller, said, they are both there to stay. There's no radical solution that involves the disappearance of either. That's not on the cards, nor should it ever be. Heaven forfend. So you have to come to some kind of arrangement. And I've spoken to plenty of Israelis, especially this one guy who was a former Air Force officer who was the top gun that took out the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1984, and he said something very wise to me. He said, unless this is an Israeli, a Jewish Israeli guy, a former IDF officer, who said, unless the Palestinians feel that they're being treated with dignity, which presumably involves some kind of prospect of a Palestinian homeland, they are right to feel aggrieved. They've got to feel that this is going their way. Now, we may not like what that means, what that feeling entails, or the Israelis may not like it, but that's got to be on the cards. So I'm still hopeful that out of all this horrific dark mess will come some kind of deal, maybe involving the Saudis, which is also extraordinary in its own right, whereby they say, okay, we'll do a deal with Israel because you want peace with Saudi Arabia, the Sunni superpower in the region, but only if you hold out the real prospect of some kind of, not just peace, but independent sovereign state for the Palestinian people, which would involve clearing out the majority of settlements which have been encouraged in recent years. So, that's talking about the West Bank, which is another incredibly tricky issue. I'm talking far too much. I'm sorry, Moz. I asked you a question. I gave you a very long answer. I apologize.
I don't disagree with anything that you've said there. I think ultimately it comes down to, and the reason why I mentioned that is militarily, that is the only outcome for you to get peace.
But there are no military solutions to this. There are only political solutions to these military conflicts.
Yeah. And it's been so heavily weighed in terms of a military response for such a long time that peace through diplomacy has never really been given an opportunity, and this is where we are now. So unless we give up,
but if Hamas gets more popular in the West Bank, and indications anecdotally are that they are, then they are also setting back the process. I mean, if you want to be serious about a two-state solution, you've got to believe in the viability and the existence of two states. And so that would be my message to the Palestinians. You've got to take this stuff seriously. The Israelis are not going to disappear. From the river to the sea doesn't work. And that, it just doesn't work, because that implies Israel disappears. You have the same slogan, but expressed in different ways, from hardliners in the Israeli government. They also want from the river to the sea, but what they want is a greater Israel. But none of those things, both of those things rather, are not options in my book. Let's go to Amjad and Leeds. Amjad, what do you think?
Hi, Matt. I'm a youthful 71-year-old. I could be 21-year-old.
My God, you sound so much younger than 71. Not a day over 69 and a half.
Listen, Matt.
You're just trying to make me feel bad, because you sound so young.
Matt, you're a very seasoned operator, and you make a lot of sense in what you say.
I can feel a butt coming, like bad English weather. I can feel a big, heavy, grey, sodden butt over the horizon. Come on, spit it out.
There's no but. I think we need to really think about what's happening out there. I think the people in the United States, the youth of the United States, have seen so much carnage, murder, rape taking place over the last 7 months. It did start unfortunately, on the 7th of October, but it did start with a reason, and I'm not justifying the reason.
Yeah. You're explaining it.
The occupation. Yeah, I'm just explaining it. Yeah. Look, 36 babies died on the Israeli side. Regrettable, wrong, absolutely indefensible. But 15,000 children dying on the Palestinian side. It's the scale is, you can't compare the two. The murder, the mayhem taking place, 90% of the infrastructure destroyed, denial of fundamentals of life. When I did biology in my youth, there were 5 fundamentals, and all of them have been denied: food, water, shelter, clothing. This is undefendable. And I think this is why the youth are incensed, and they're going out in the campuses. And you rightly said earlier, Matt, that because in this country we've allowed, and rightly so, the fundamental of democracy, people to protest. And this has taken the sting out of what's happening in the United States. And there were politicians in our country who were calling us hate marchers. I will be going out today in Leeds and demonstrating. And I think this is a fundamental of democracy. And we were called all sorts of names to shut us down. Lots of good people have been thrown out of great institutions. We are no longer trustees. We are no longer members of parties because we've expressed an opinion on the Palestinian side. We've been shut up. This is not on. I think there are two sides. You cannot have the destruction of the state of Israel. You have to have the state of Palestine. You can't have God acting as though he's an estate agent who's given one people a land, the only land in the world.
Yeah. That's a good line. The thing is, I don't know if I was in Israel for 5 weeks or so for Channel 4 News, and every night we've picked a different location, mostly in Jerusalem because of the extraordinary backdrop and because there's so much politics there. And the one that I liked most was a little balcony in the old Jewish quarter of the old city. And it overlooked the western wall of the temple, otherwise known as the Wailing Wall. And then right above it, of course, you have the dome of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then round the corner is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ was supposedly buried. Now, you can't see that, but this idea that in that particular part of the world, it's location for the 3 great monotheistic religions, cheek by jowl, on top of each other. And it's the kind of symbol of what's happening in this conflict as well. No one is going anywhere. They are there to stay. You've got to find some arrangement, some shared use of bathroom and kitchen.
That's why you call it the Holy Land. Well, it should be fit for the 3 Abrahamic faiths. It should be, I've visited Al-Aqsa Mosque. I've paid a visit to the Wailing Wall. I've been to the churches as well. And this is, as you say, a land fit for all three, and people of no faith as well. It shouldn't be just for one at the expense of the other. And unless we have that justice, we're going to have this war, a perpetual war going on. And this is what we have to stop.
And just on the note, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a sort of a mosaic of different rival Christian, factions and faiths. So you have, the Ethiopian Copts are kind of somewhere up in the, in the Egyptian Copts are rather somewhere up kind of by the roof. And then you've got the Armenian Christians, you've got, the Catholics, you've got Protestants, everyone's there. And such was the division within this one Christian church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that the keys were given to a Jordanian Muslim at one stage.
Correct.
Right. So,
correct. Up to this date.
And the big up to this date. And the bigger point is that you kind of need an honest outside broker to come in to this conflict and say, look, guys, we got to sit down here and sort something out. And there is no such honest broker. The United States will not be seen as an honest broker. The Saudis won't be seen as an honest broker. The Russians can't be. The United Nations has been undermined by the Israeli government over and over again. Who can come in and knock their heads together in the nicest possible way? I don't see anyone, to be honest.
I think, Matt, we need something like the agreement in Northern Ireland, where honest broker has to. And
that is what optimists say to me. It would be great to have a Belfast moment, as they call it, in Israel, Palestine as well. I don't see one coming. I wish there was. Amjad in Leeds, thanks very much. Let's go to Jude in Acton. Jude, you're on the air.
Yes, hello. Hi, Matt.
Hi.
The main cause of protests, and any kind of protest, is injustice of any kind, either politically or economically. And the kind of injustice that we see towards the Palestinians is just what motivates people to keep going. Myself, as an example, every time I say, you know what, I'm not going to go to the Saturday march. I'm tired. I work 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week. I'm going to take a break. And then I look through my social media and I see, things probably I can't even say on the phone. Sure. A father holding his 2 children dead, and I say, you know what, I can't. I have to do something. I can't do anything.
But I agree with you. I think injustice is a great motivator in all this. But what slightly surprises me is that the very people who are kind of slamming me on social media for saying, this particular chapter of this long-running story started with October the 7th, are also people who I kind of think, what were you doing on October the 6th? Were you demonstrating about this? Because this issue, which has been with us for a very long time, kind of ebbs and flows. And of course, at the moment, it's at a high watermark. But, for years, people just didn't want to hear about it.
It's the volume. It's the volume. For example, there was always pro-Palestine protest, not to this volume. No. Always.
But of course, the volume is proportional to the...
I've been to so many, but they're not that big. Okay? Yeah. What's happening now is, for example, I'm going to protest, the next protest, I saw a video of a girl, a 4-year-old girl, shaking, half burnt, and even my daughter happened to walk and saw the video, and I quickly switched it off. Yeah. And I was a tear in my eye. I said, Daddy, what are you doing? This kind of things motivates people to go and keep protesting. And these protests will never end until the injustice towards the Palestinian, there is a solution to it. And by the way, adding to that, seeing our government unconditional support for Israel, that's also a big motivation as well.
Yeah. And indeed the Labour Party, which is, you could argue has been, we know it's been criticised for its its support of the Israeli government. And of course that line has changed recently. But if you are politically motivated and you're very critical of what the Israeli government has done, as many people are, then you might have thought, certainly for a long time during the last 6 months, that you weren't being heard properly. Although I think that is now changing. The extent to how far it's changing is an open question.